Hey folks, welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning. We're going to give folks a couple more minutes to trickle in. But in the meantime, if you want to join us in the chat and you can share your name, your pronouns, and your organization affiliation and where you are joining us from today. So welcome everyone. Thank you for being here again bright and early on a Friday morning. We appreciate your time for this conversation today. My name is Ali Yee. I use she, her pronouns. I am the co-executive director of finance, operations, and development at Apano Communities United Fund. I wanted to share kind of some goals of the convening that we are all joined here today. So our purpose here today, there's a couple goals in mind. Some of this is like a starting point. Some of this is a focus for today. A big one is around partnerships. We really hope that this event can be an invitation to you all to join with Pacific Islander and Asian leaders and organizations across the state and really get into how do our goals align around our priorities of racial justice, around empowerment, around inclusion and leadership. And not only are the ways that we can support our communities in the Asian Pacific Islander communities, but also how our communities can work in solidarity and be part of broader efforts for intersectional and racial justice in Oregon. So we hope that this will be the start of more partnership, more collaboration. A big chunk of today is going to be education. We'll be sharing a lot of stories, a lot of information with you all. There will be a lot of content, I think, to process today with the Zoom webinar format. We felt that this sharing of information was more facilitated versus kind of relationship building, which I hope we can do in future engagements. A couple things. We hope that this event can help develop an equity lens that folks can use when understanding Asian and Pacific Islander communities. We hope that our stories and experiences can help break down the model minority myth that's often associated with our communities and help folks go beyond seeing Asian and Pacific Islanders as a monolith. And then our third goal today is really around connection. We won't have as much relationship building, but we hope that this can be an initial point of connection. We hope that this can facilitate some contact sharing and further conversation and more connection building. So that is our agenda for today, or not our agenda, but kind of our overarching purpose. And I want to also start the day with a land acknowledgement. And this is some language that we have borrowed from the Resilience series that Apano hosts to intro their events. But I'll read this quote aloud from Adrian Wong of the Spiderweb Show. Since our activities are shared digitally on the internet, let's also take a moment to consider the legacy of colonization embedded within the technology, structures, and ways of thinking we use every day. We're using equipment and high-speed internet not available in many Indigenous communities. Even the technologies that are central to much of the art that we make leave significant carbon footprints contributing to changing climates that disproportionately affect Indigenous peoples worldwide. So really considering our digital footprint as we engage online today. Also wanted to acknowledge in the next slide here, I invite you to join me in acknowledging this as our shared responsibility to make good use of this time and for each other, for us to consider our roles in reconciliation, decolonization, and accompliceship. In addition, since many of us are zooming in from Oregon today, we are currently seated on the traditional lands of the Multnomah, Ethlamet, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Wasco, Cowlitz, Clackamas, Band of Chinook, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River. And land acknowledgement is good, but land back is better. A quote from Dr. Kutcha Risling-Baldi. And so we encourage folks also to learn about and support these Indigenous organizations that are here in the Pacific Northwest. Great. As we get started, I think we wanted to do a little temperature check, get folks' responses in the room here and do a little poll. The first question is, does your organization currently support Asian and Pacific Islander organizations? We'll give folks a couple couple seconds here to share their responses. All right, there's like a couple final ones trickling in. I'm assuming you do. So there's a lot of folks here. It sounds like there is a focus on supporting Asian Pacific Islander communities as part of a broader strategy or as part of a specific strategy, and some folks who are considering or not sure. So thank you for sharing that. That's great to see that there is a focus and interest there. Our next question for the poll is, what are you hoping to learn or take away from today's convening? And we gave a couple options, but if there's something else there that you want to share in the chat, please feel free to type it in and share there. Great, a lot of interest in learning more generally about Asian Pacific Islander communities, as well as specific communities and connecting with leaders. Got a couple coming in the chat, looking forward to learning more specifically about Pacific Islander communities. Well, thank you all, and I hope that we can speak to these things that folks are hoping to learn with our agenda today. We'll take a quick look at that in the next slide. So these are the main three agenda items we have today. We will take some breaks in between because I know Zoom for hours is very challenging. Our first session is going to be What's in a Name. It'll be a panel discussion where we're going to interrogate the AAPI acronym. We'll take a little break and then we'll come back to do kind of a presentation to provide some context on Asian and Pacific Islander communities in Oregon. And then we'll take another break after that. And then finally, our session will be in our own words, where several speakers will share with us about their specific communities, so that we do get to hear and learn from folks directly in that time. In the next slide, I have a couple reminders. First of all, take care of yourself. As I mentioned, Zoom is exhausting and we do have an ambitious agenda today. So please do what you need to take care of yourself in this time. Another really important reminder is to create space for multiple truths. No one knows everything. No one speaks on behalf of an entire race or ethnicity or community. All of their speakers here today are joining us to share from their own experience and their own perspective, and also remembering that there are many perspectives within communities and across communities, and many communities beyond those who are speaking with us today. Respect each other as you're asking questions of panelists, as you engage in the chat with each other as well. Please remember respect and reach out if you need assistance. If you have any technical questions, we have two great folks, Emmy and Anka, working on tech and production for this event. And so you can call, text, or email Emmy directly. Her phone number is there and her email is there. And Emmy, I wonder if you might also just drop that in the chat real quick. And I think Emmy had also shared earlier that we do have closed captioning. And so I believe you can enable captioning to get that feature for this webinar. In the next slide, I wanted to talk about our Vote Network partners who helped us develop this event, and many of whom are speakers today. Vote Network, VOTE stands for the Voter Organizing Training and Empowerment Network. It is a network of Asian and Pacific Islander organizations and community groups, about 15 to 20 of them usually, that APANO has convened since about 2016 to understand community needs, to increase civic engagement and build power among our communities. We've worked on Get Out the Vote campaigns during elections, the 2020 census, on policy advocacy. And so a subset of those partners here volunteered to be part of our advisory group to help advise the planning of this event. So a big thank you to Lisa, May, Jackie, Jess, and Gloria, and you'll get to hear from many of them today. I also wanted to do a quick shout out. Thank you to some of my colleagues at APANO, Karen and Kale and Kua and Duncan, who have helped support this, the development of this event. And of course, a big thank you to several funders who have supported APANO and the Vote Network in exploring some of these big themes around how we strengthen our ecosystem and network of organizations and kind of build a stronger foundation for how we support and empower our community. So thank you to the Meyer Memorial Trust, the Collins Foundation, Oregon Community Foundation, and Oregon Worker Relief Fund. And on that note, I would love to invite Kaberi Banerjee Murthy with the Meyer Memorial Trust to share a few words from Meyer's perspective.
Thank you for inviting me to be in community with you this morning. I'm Kaberi Banerjee Murthy. I'm Chief Impact Officer at Meyer Memorial Trust. And it's an honor to be here and to get to represent the Meyer team. We've had the privilege of working with Apano and many other incredible organizations advancing racial justice in Oregon for many years now. And I'm so excited to be in this space with you for this morning for a whole host of reasons. But I wanted to start with two personal ones. When I was in grad school many, many eons ago, my focus was on issues of access and equity for students of color. And my thesis was on the importance of disaggregating data for Asian American students to better understand our experiences, to better support us. And I remember the resistance and the lack of understanding that existed as I defended my thesis. And I'm really grateful for a space here today that feels so different. It's heartening to look in the Zoom room and the list of participants and see so many folks here ready to listen and to learn, to understand the commonalities and the nuances of our experiences so we can better see the wholeness of each and all of us. The other appreciation I have to lift up is how inspiring it is to look at the phenomenal leadership that's here within our grantee partners, within our electeds, within philanthropy. When I started as a very new program officer back in 2000, I was often the youngest in the room, the only Asian American in the room, the only person of color in the room, and many, many times the only woman of color in the room. And as I look at where we are now, it's heartening to see how so many people with lived experiences are actually in the room and helping to shape decisions. Representation matters and lived experience matters. It informs the work and the decisions. We can understand the work with our heads, with our hearts, and with our whole self. And as a result, speaking as a funder, we're able to move resources to support the work and move us all towards justice. It really makes me grateful for that reason for the folks and the work that we're doing at Meyer. And recently we've devoted a good amount of time listening to community and reimagining the way we can do our work. Earlier this year, our board approved an exciting and ambitious new mission statement that centers justice and a strategic framework that utilizes an anti-racist, intersectional, feminist lens to guide all of our work. And that's in large part due to the fact that we have heard over and over again that people do not live single issue lives, nor does the hard work of our grantee partners fit into neat and tidy boxes. Our identities are complex, our lives and our experiences are interconnected. We are bound together, so we will rise or fall together. Meyer, as many other foundations, was established at a different moment from the one that we find ourselves in now. But we were also founded with the freedom and, in fact, the mandate to be able to respond to the challenges and opportunities of our changing times. And as we begin our 40th anniversary, we're excited about the opportunities ahead of us to support organizations like Apano and others to collectively build movements, strengthen communities, and transform systems throughout Oregon. And that's why I'm so looking forward to hearing the stories and the research that are about to be shared here today, and to support the important work being done to understand and honor the multiple places and spaces, experiences, and identities of our powerful Asian American Pacific Islander community. So thank you, Apano, for bringing us together and organizing such a thoughtful offering for the day, especially the data that can ground us and call us to action. Thank you for the Vote Network and all those sharing their stories that really bring the numbers to life. Thank you to the leaders in all spaces that are working in all sorts of ways every day to continue to push for justice. And thank you to the funders that I see here showing up as an ally to hear the cry and move the money. Collectively, there is so much for us to do, and I have no doubt that we will. So looking forward to today.
Thank you so much, Kaberi, for sharing those words and for being with us today and for fitting us into your busy schedule. I know you need to run as well. Thank you for sharing that and grounding us. So before we move into our first session, I wanted to highlight again, we are recording this session and we'll have a recording available after this to share out with the attendees. And also, I believe Emmy dropped a copy of the slides in the chat. So if you wanted to take a look, there is a lot of information in them. Some of the text is a little small. So if you want to follow along with those slides directly, please feel free to access them from that link. And before we jump into our panel discussion, I just wanted to invite everyone. I feel like we've kind of come in to a whirlwind Friday morning to maybe just take a deep breath here as well as our panelists, who I know we're about to have conversation with. Just invite folks to take a deep breath at your own pace. Fill your lungs, fill it deep into your belly, and let it out. Nice long breath till it empties out of your body. Great. Well, thank you for joining me in that. I think it's sometimes helpful to get grounded back in our bodies as we're about to have conversations that are kind of personal and can be complicated and are meaningful. So thank you for joining me in that. And with that, I would love to turn to our first conversation. We are going to go into a panel discussion. We've called this session, What's in a Name? And this came up from our advisory group conversations. We were like, should we use API? Should we not use API? There were a lot of different ideas. And it's like, oh, there isn't consensus. There isn't one right word to use or one right acronym. There's baggage in some way. There is some power in it in some ways. And we just felt that it would be worthwhile to share this discussion with folks today on the different perspectives and reactions folks have to this acronym and how folks have experienced it in different ways. And so we have 3 folks who are going to be sharing with us. So I'm actually going to start with May. So May is a community advocate for the Yumian community. She is the first generation born in the US and identifies as Mien American. Professionally, May is a civil servant for the state government, where she has spent over 15 years in public safety, and she spends her spare time advocating for underrepresented and marginalized communities, including the Mien and Southeast Asian communities. And May, as we'll hear, folks are playing multiple roles in their communities on top of having full-time jobs. And so she wasn't able to join us live today, but she recorded her responses for the panel questions. And so we'll share that as we go through our conversation. Next, I want to introduce Jess Gasper, who is the president of the Oregon Marshallese Community Association, also referred to as OMCA sometimes. And this is a role that he's held since 2018. And after a career in business, Jess has dedicated the last 5 years of his life to bringing light to the struggles of Marshallese citizens in the US and helping Marshallese Americans realize their dreams. And then we also want to welcome Kathleen Jonathan, who is also a native Marshallese, an educator, and a community advocate with the COFA Alliance National Network. She has worked with the Salem-Keizer School District for over 20 years and works as a community resource specialist for Pacific Islander students. And she has a passion for community organizing and addressing inequities by taking them to where decisions are being made and impacting policy. So welcome, Jess and Kathleen. Thank you for being here with us today. And as we jump in, I just wanted to start us with a little bit of context on, where did the API acronym come from? Where did this name come from that we all got lumped together? There is a pretty helpful Seattle Times article that I will share out after this that summarizes some of the evolution, but the original term Asian American is generally thought to have come out of the Pan-Asian student movement of the 1960s as part of an effort to unify what had been disparate Asian American groups into an umbrella that acknowledged shared history, identity, and also rejected the antiquated term of Oriental. By the 1980s, the US Census had expanded that name to include Asians and Pacific Islanders together, kind of creating the API category. A couple decades later, they disaggregated that. So there's now an Asian category and then another category that is called Native Hawaiian, another Pacific Islander. And in census world often is listed as NHPI. But since then, the umbrella terms for API or APA, Asian Pacific American, also in Apano's original name, Asian Pacific American, have stuck around. And I think we have some different reactions to that name. And so I think we want to dive into that. And so our first question is kind of around, when did you first hear API or API, and what was your reaction to the acronym? What resonated with you about it or what didn't? And we're going to start with May's recording of her response to this question, and then we'll move into our live panelists.
There was a lot of inaccuracies about that because we, as a community of Southeast Asians, we do not achieve as high. And there are a lot of needs in a lot of areas that are ignored because of the model minority myth and because of the association of just being API. And it really also transpires to the systems not knowing how to care for our communities just because of that, because they don't know who we really are. And just a lot of issues. There are a lot of things that I think about when I think about the acronym AAPI. When I was younger, it was a matter of convenience. It was easy just to tell people I was Asian. And for them, it was easy for them to understand. It was easy for me to explain. As somebody who is Indigenous, it saved me from having to give a really long-winded explanation about who we are. Those are some things that we're still even discussing in our own community. And so imagine having to explain that to somebody else who does not understand what your community or who you are. For us also, being Asian, there was a lot of good stereotypes associated with that. It was being somebody who was academically successful, who had rich parents, high income household, had a lot of nice material things. And so it was just easy all around just to be Asian. Even at a younger age, we saw that our parents were, there was a really high rate of illiteracy. There was a lot of adults who had no high school or college education. A lot of them worked in manufacturing plants. A lot of our teenagers also did not graduate high school. And so we were almost everything that was the exact opposite of the model minority. But for us, it was kind of like a security blanket too. It made us kind of not have to face the struggles and the reality that came with it. As I've gotten older and started doing a little bit more work, advocacy in the communities, I see how much of those issues still remain. I am in a lot of spaces where we rely on data to do, to provide services and resources, especially to different communities. And as I advocate for the Mien community and Southeast Asians, I find it really difficult just because how the way, data is collected, how it aggregates us all into one big group. There's not really any information for anybody to rely on in terms of identifying issues within specific communities. I find that even 40 years, since the first refugee, the Mien refugee or Southeast Asian landed here in the United States, we're still having to explain who we are. And I think, part of, one of the biggest reasons why that is still an issue is because we are still just largely known as Asian Pacific Islander.
May's recording was kind of from a broader conversation that got recorded and edited. So I apologize that there might be a couple points where she was referencing something else that maybe we did not record or play for this time, but she was referring to the Mian community specifically in that response. And I'm curious if I could turn it to you, Jess, of your reaction to the API acronym.
Thank you, everybody. The API acronym. I think us Marshallese, when somebody says, or just me in general, I mean, I can't relate to the word API. When somebody said there's an API event, or there's a even Pacific Islander, when you a group, you know, are Pacific Islanders, I think it kind of takes away from our uniqueness. Like Marshallese people will not come to just a Pacific Islander event, or they don't relate to, you know, just being called Pacific Islanders, because it takes away from our own identity. You know, so we're very proud of who we are. Even individual atolls or individual islands, they take pride in, like, you know, being Bikinian or being from Majuro or being from Jelut. So, you know, just it's grouping us all into one big group of people. We can't identify with that, and that's just how I think, I feel, and most of my colleagues feel about that term API.
Thank you, Jess. Kathleen, I'm curious what your sense or reaction is.
Thank you, Ali. You know, when I lived in the Marshall Islands and then moved to Hawaii, I don't remember people from these places using the term Pacific Islanders, or even, I mean, you use the terms Asians, Pacific Islanders, but I don't remember people saying, oh, I'm a Pacific Islander or I'm Asian, until I came to Oregon. And it was really sort of like a culture shock when I heard, oh, Pacific Islanders. I'm like, nobody uses that term. Nobody that associates with being an islander, at least from my perspective. And so I started, you know, I was doing culture presentations for educators and started, you know, letting people know we don't use these terms. And they asked me, well, what do you use? And I said, well, we use our nationality. I'm a Marshallese instead of I'm a Pacific Islander, because that's how we associate ourselves with. It's just like somebody, you know, the Americas is big. There's North America, Central America, South America. So for somebody to say, I'm American, that's very, very broad. It doesn't identify who the person is. And so for me, again, the terms API or AAPI, that was very foreign when I first came to Oregon and started working with the school district. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for sharing. Yeah, I think it is kind of interesting that there is this category that gets placed on people when they come to the US, when they've always thought of themselves as their specific community that they came from, right? And now there's a whole group of people that you are being lumped in with or being associated with. Kathleen, you started to speak to this a little bit about, like, what are the names that people do identify with? And also going back to what Jess was saying about, like, if you see something that says API Pacific Islander, you don't think it's for you. What are the ways that folks can communicate in a way that does resonate, that, like, this is for you, this is relevant for you? Kathleen, I might send it back to you first, since you kind of are starting us down that conversation.
You know, it's really identifying the people that you're talking to. If you say, hey, this is for the Marshallese community, or this is for the Palauan community, really addressing who the event or whatever it is that you're trying to get people to participate, instead of just giving a broader title, because like Jess said, we don't associate with the term API or AAPI. That can really prevent people from pursuing, because even when we have events for just Pacific Islanders, that's also too broad. So you really, in order to bring in community members, they need to be somebody that they trust, needs to be the one inviting them, or at least connecting with whoever's putting on whatever event is happening. Uh, because you can say, well, this is for the Marshallese community. But if there's no connection between the community and what's happening, you're not going to get people to be invested in that.
Jess, any thoughts to add or?
Yeah, I feel the same way. I think Islanders really want their identity out there. You know, we feel offended sometimes when somebody takes that away from us and just groups us together, and we want to be acknowledged by who we are. Marshallese folks, you know, Samoan folks. We don't want to be grouped together, and if we're address us in a way that we can be and feel respected.
I also want to share May's response to this question.
That is actually a very difficult question to explain, just because of the background that of our community. I think I shared a little bit earlier. There is still quite a big debate in our community about the origin of our people and our history, just because we did not have those resources. And so everything that we had was written in, or not written, but collected through oral history. I don't know where to begin to talk about, you know, our identity and what we identify with. We're a small indigenous hill tribe group with strong ancestral roots from China. But sometime during the Han Dynasty, a lot of our community members were banished from China, and the ones who left sought refuge in neighboring countries like Laos and Vietnam and Thailand. And but here in the United States and elsewhere, because our people had helped in the Secret War, we were given asylum alongside a lot of the other Southeast Asians. And so when we came here, we were classified as Southeast Asians. I don't know if there is an actual word that helps to identify who we are, except that we're Mien. I know a lot of Mien people, including me, were proud of our heritage. We're proud to be Mien. But as I've explained a little bit earlier, it's very complicated. It's a very messy situation to have to explain, you know, to the broader community about who you are. I feel like there's probably 4 or 5 parts into explaining who the Mien community, who they are and what they are. But for us, we're proud to be Mien. We would love to just be recognized as Mien. And we would love to have a system that also is able to identify us and how we identify ourselves.
Well, great. And if folks have questions coming up for the panelists, at least for Kathleen and Jess, who are here live, you can start to drop those in the chat. I believe Emmy is going to be monitoring those and will help relay those to us towards the end when we do a Q&A. And then May also said that she is available for questions and follow-up as well. So we'll drop her email address in the chat if you'd like to reach out and ask May any questions. In our third session, we'll also have Kale Turn, who's our Apanos Immigrant Program Manager, who's also Mien, and may also be able to speak to some of the questions if you have those as well. Just prompting for the questions. I'm curious to go to this next question around when is it especially important that specific communities are named and recognized? And then I think the flip side of that, maybe afterwards, is like, when is it important to come together as a pan-ethnic or pan-community sort of way? But I think we'll start maybe first with like, what are those moments where it feels really important that specific communities are recognized and named? And maybe Jess, do you want to get us started on this one? Or
I think when it comes to health, things that relate to our population, like specifically education, maybe, we would want to be addressed in a way that we know, because again, if we go back to the broader, acronym of who we are grouped together in a specific, trying to get the attention of a specific group, I think it's very important to address and identify them as who they are. But I think when it comes to, broader things like, I don't know, like for example, that Asian Pacific Islanders are only getting 1% of grants or things like that, I think that's okay. Speaking in terms of like the broader sense of like, this group of people are only getting this much of something. That way they can understand that even in that broader sense of group of people, there's still so many different groups in that group. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think when it's really important, education, health, things that really identify and that we can be receptive to and listen to, it's very important to identify who we are, because we can jump on it right away, get it done, relatable things like that. I think that's when we want to be really identified.
thank you, Jess. I think May shared some similar sort of sentiments as that as well. So I wonder if we could play her response.
I think it's always important to recognize communities as who they are. I think, especially because we have developed a system where we often have institutions and people who are higher educated, being experts of other communities, when in reality, communities have, especially marginalized communities, don't really have a lot of say in what their needs are. And I would say, if you can ever have the opportunity, if you're ever in the space to advocate for someone, let them be their own content expert. It really does a lot to, mobilize the community. It really gives a sense of empowerment. When you're talking about lifting communities, that is one way to do it, is to let them be their own content experts. I would say, there's a lot to a name. A name doesn't just represent who they are to themselves, but also to the broader community. For instance, in my, lived experience as a Mien person, like I said earlier, I shared my experience and also the experience of many Southeast Asians that I knew, who always just, said, yes, I'm API, or I'm Asian. And what that did was it led to a lot of harm in our community, a lot of false beliefs, not just in our community, but the broader community. It led to 40 years later, we're still explaining who we are just because we always were just Asian. It does a lot. And for people like me, being nationless, being indigenous, that's all we have is who we are and our identity. And so, if you were to ever ask how important that is, that's, the utmost important thing is really what's in a name is, sometimes that's all what people have is just their identity.
Kathleen, I'd love to turn to you and hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Ellie. So the first question, when do you think it's important to name and recognize specific communities? When it's relevant. I always do my homework when I'm working with individual families. So it's necessary to do the homework, find out what the culture background is, what is the immigration status, or what is the connection of the community to the United States, what is their history. Get to know the targeted community or communities and ask them how they want to be identified. In my work, with this push for equity, and we use a tool, the Equity Lines tool, which it's got purpose, inclusivity, barriers, and outcomes. And so we have to ask these questions: what are we trying to achieve when we're working with communities and using terminologies that either identifies or doesn't identify the communities that we're targeting? Who's impacted by the decision? So it's really just asking. It's okay to ask people, how do they want to be identified as? And to answer the second question, when do you think it's important to come together as a pan-ethnic, pan-racial identity? And do you have any thoughts on ways to do that when your community continues to be recognized? Well, Apano has been instrumental in bringing community members of the Asian and Pacific Islanders during lobby days. That's just one example. And I've been involved in Apano's lobby days since I discovered Apano. And so they bring very intentional, bringing people together to impact change in the policies that affect the lives of all residents in Oregon, especially the communities that they serve, but especially the marginalized communities and the ones that are always overshadowed by the more affluent and communities that have already overcome barriers and struggles, and paving the way for the more recent immigrants. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen, for sharing that. Yeah, I think would love to start, diving deeper into that conversation of like, when does it make sense to come together more broadly, right? There is, we'll talk a little bit about this later on, but there's like a COFA identity, that's a couple different groups. There's like Pacific Islander identity, that's more groups. There's like within Asia, there's many different, there's like Southeast Asia and South Asia, and different ways that folks can find commonality or identity. Kathleen, you were pointing to coming together when it comes to speaking to policy, legislation, and those kinds of areas where we can come together to leverage our power. So I guess like, Jess, I'm also curious, like where you see that being good, not just in the realm of like power building, but it could also be, I'm imagining, like the COVID response as well, right? Like there was very targeted, but there was also community-wide advocacy to uplift folks collectively. So I'm curious your thoughts on like, where are those opportunities or how to do that in a way that also folks don't get lost, right? Don't get kind of lost in the acronym, but come together.
Yes, I mean, that is one of the biggest things that we had so much feedback on was the COVID response, right? In Oregon, they showed a category where Pacific Islanders were like #1 in COVID infections, and we put that out on our social media, outlets or Facebooks, and we had so much cry from our communities like, wait a minute, the Pacific Islanders is so broad. I mean, why can't they just say Marshallese, or why can't they just say, and we had so many requests, like, can you find out from the state, tell them to break it down, because we want to know if it is us, that they're trying to call out. So in those times, I think it's very important. And even in like voting, right? We want our name, like Marshallese, in that category of things that, the documentation, from the state and federal level. We want to be acknowledged in those situations too. But, to kind of piggyback on what Kathleen just just said. If it's a goal, that every COFA or every Pacific Islander needs dental assistance. Yeah, we don't mind grouping everybody else together and then going out there and supporting one another.
Thank you, Jess. And I know we're dropping some acronyms now, so I want to highlight COFA is the Compact of Free Association. To talk about it in the presentation piece as well, but an agreement between, I believe it's 3 Pacific Islander nations in the US. We'll get into that in a second, but it allows folks to live and work in the US, but did not extend benefits entirely as well. And I wonder if we could also share May's response to this question of when to come together. And then I think we'll move into some open Q&A. So if folks have questions for panelists, please drop them in there. And I'm also Kathleen and Jess, if y'all have any other topics around this that I haven't prompted or other reflections, would love to just open it up.
As much as I've emphasized about the importance of self-identity with communities, it is also really important for us to be able to come together, just because as important as it is to be unique and allowing us to really be individuals, it is also really important that we're able to come together in times of need. We see that specifically, in cases like the pandemic, where, the entire API community was riddled with anti-Asian hate, a lot of the same disparities that we're also facing with health, with education, with employment. There's lots of similar traits that we share just because, we're from the same regions. We sometimes experience the same social issues. Sometimes, we share the same customs and practices. So it's really important to allow us to come together, but also find ways where we could share our own individual cultures as well with one another. And being able to have people see that visibly we are the same, but we're also different as well. And I don't know what that is going to look like. It's a matter of people allowing us to have that space to be able to do that.
Kathleen and Jess, open up to you if at all. Any thoughts?
Okay, I'll just add. I think I may have missed one of the earlier questions where I just wanted to add to what was just being said in terms of what resonates with me or with folks in my community about the terms, and I wanted to add more to that. When I'm the only time I can think of that I use, the term PI, Pacific Islander, is when I'm filling out application or paperwork for government agencies such as DMV. That's one agency. The idea of having solidarity for API or Asian Pacific Islanders when they are grouped together is very powerful, but the data must be disaggregated. This system is all about data. It's, funding is based on data. And so to really be intentional in providing equitable services to marginalized communities within our Asian and Pacific Islander community, the data really needs to be disaggregated because just under the Pacific Islander umbrella, there's so many different island nations and languages. The cultures might have similarities, but they are not the same. They also have different immigration status. We have the Melanesian, and within Melanesia, there's New Guinea, there's New Caledonia, there's Vanuatu, there's Fiji and Solomon Islands. And then there's Polynesia, which includes New Zealand, Hawaiian Islands, Rotuma, Midway Islands, Samoa, American Samoa, Tonga, Tuvalu, Cook Islands, French Polynesia, and Easter Island. And then there's Micronesia, which includes the Marianas, Guam, Wake Island, and some of these are probably old, but you know what I mean. There's the Republic of Palau, there's the Republic of the Marshall Islands, there's Kiribati, there's Nauru, and then the Federated States of Micronesia, and which within Federated States of Micronesia, there are the 4 states of Chuuk, Yap, Kusrai, and Pohnpei. So when you think about the word Pacific Islander, it might seem like, oh, it's one group. But no, there's so many different groups, so many different languages, so many different islands. And this is why we're pushing for the data to be disaggregated. And when it was reported that the Pacific Islanders were disproportionately impacted by COVID, I did not see any report on which community was the most impacted. But for me, I saw the number of deaths in my community and other communities that are from the Kofa Island nations. I thought it was like every weekend there was a funeral, 1 or 2. And it's, this is, we were not, right after the war, the treaties, the Compact of Free Associations were established between the 3 island nations, like Marshall Islands and the United States. Federated States of Micronesia had their treaty between the United States, and so did Palau. But when the welfare reform, we were clumped with all other immigrants and were denied state services or even access. And up until December 30, 2020, the previous administration signed the bill, and now we have access to healthcare. And that says a lot about the disproportionate, how the pandemic disproportionately impacted the Pacific Islanders. Thank you. I just wanted to add that.
Very, very powerful context on that. I think what I am kind of hearing through this conversation is that there is power in coming together when there's recognition and empowerment within the individual groups that come together, right? That power is not as meaningful if that coming together is erasing or invisibilizing or pushing back any of the member groups. And I think in that way, it's really about solidarity, like what is our solidarity practice with each other? So, that like just grouping everything under API is not just going to be the answer, right? And I think Asian American or, pulling the group together came from a sense of wanting to build shared power. And I think that there are issues with how people feel about API because there has not always been that shared power, right, between the groups. And so I really appreciate folks sharing their perspectives as part of this panel. We have a couple questions, and I believe we have until 10:15. So I'd love to turn to the questions that we have. The first question, I believe, is around folks' multiracial identities or mixed culture backgrounds, potentially being more than one race, which is actually very, very common among Pacific Islanders and among Asian folks. There's a question here about how should one address being questioned about identity? And man, like that's a big one, right? In multiple ways, even if you're not mixed race. So I'm curious if folks, Kathleen or Jess, if you want to share any perspective on that.
I guess I can go first since Kathleen took the other opportunity. Thank you, Kathleen. I'm multi-racial. My father's Filipino and my mom is from the Marshall Islands. And for me, it's what I grew up with, what I'm more comfortable with. See, I grew up with my mom's side, so I identify myself as Marshallese more than I am Filipino. So I think it's, the individual themselves, how they feel what they feel comfortable with in that kind of, when it comes to whatever race. But I think there's also like in government and agency forms, they give you that opportunity to pick whatever race you are, right? Multiple choice. You can pick more than just one, or add other and write it down. So, but for me, I usually identify as Marshallese because that's what I grew up and that's what I'm more comfortable.
And along those same lines, again, do your homework, ask questions, and I agree with just, I have Japanese blood in my family. My maternal grandfather was half Japanese, half Marshallese. And there's a little bit of Kiribati in there. So there's a mix, but I grew up Marshallese. I identify as Marshallese. And it's okay to ask people, like, what do you identify as? It's the same idea with the gender question. You were born this way, but what do you identify as? Thank you. Oh, sorry, one more. In terms of the government documents, when you're applying for filling out applications and there's those, like Jess said, there's that question, like it says mixed race or something. That also needs to be specified, excuse me, for data purposes again. If they're wanting data, they need to provide the tools like, okay, if you're mixed, list all the ethnicities you identify with. Thank you.
Thank you both. Definitely a very live and confusing question at times, but follow the individual's lead, right? There's another question here. Can someone speak to how well unified many API communities are in Oregon, especially for lobbying efforts and in regards to responding to events such as the violence inflicted upon members of this diverse community? That's a big one. Do either of y'all want to jump in on that? You can pass as well. You don't have to have all the answers to all the things.
I can try. I go back to my the days that I was involved with Apano during lobby days, and I think it's just like the general community of Oregon. There's a mix of how people feel, but for at least for the Marshallese community, when they don't know, they're not going to participate. So there's a lot of education prior to bringing these information to the community members, because people need to have that background information in order to make a well-informed decisions. Otherwise, they'll just take whatever they see on the internet because they don't know. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think this is a big topic. How well unified are the communities? I mean, it's all about how well you organize with your partners, right? And organize with your community members of how unified. There's, I'll speak from my knowledge of like Asian community leaders. There's great diversity in how we want to respond to anti-Asian hate and violence, for example. And I think in any community there, no one is, as I mentioned earlier, right? Like no one speaks on behalf of the entire community. There isn't like one stance that a community takes. So it's really about who you work with, how you engage folks on the issues, how you build relationships with them. And it's hard, right? Because there is such diversity, right? There's the language pieces, the cultural competency, the histories, the experiences that folks have had. So I think internally it can be challenging there. I see Gloria shared in the chat for Chinese and Chinese American community, there is alignment with the Japanese community in the Rise Against Hate campaign, in my opinion. Yeah, there's definitely ways of commonality. If we have a minute, I actually was curious, Jess and Kathleen, this is something I've been wondering about during COVID, is that I'm curious how, so there's this big, narrative around like anti-Asian hate, right? But a lot of the groups are also talking about it as it's affecting API communities. And I'm curious how much, I feel like it's good to be specific when we're talking about Asian and not say API if it's not API, and if it is API, that there is real inclusivity in how we talk about API overall. So I guess I'm curious, like, around that anti-Asian hate narrative, the violence, the racism, are you seeing that come up in your communities, or how do you kind of react to that framing?
I just want to add to the unified, connections that we have with our Pacific Islander coalitions or organizations. OMCA, we're not a C4, so if there is an issue that legislative issue that we need to address that involves Marshallese, we try to collaborate with CAN. That's who we look up to when it comes to things like that. When it comes to things like a COVID response, we joined Oregon Pacific Islander Coalition, I believe that's what it's called, to tackle on those issues. So we try to be involved with both of our partners as much as we can. When it comes to bigger issues that are outside the realm of just Marshallese folks. And I believe there's issues that do come our way, and we usually bring those up in meetings that we have with our partners, whether it's CAN or whether it's Oregon Pacific or whether it's Apano in that big of a stage. Because when it's just a Marshallese issue, we try to take care of it from a Marshallese perspective as a Marshallese organization that advocates for the Marshallese here in Oregon. But a lot of our, unilateral, I guess, efforts would be done through these two, our main partners, OPIC and CAN. And I just want to give a shout out to Jacinta. She was talking about the Chamorro and how she wants to be acknowledged on those forums as well. And we see those all across the Pacific Islanders, how they want to be identified as themselves. So, yes, Jacinta.
To answer your question, Ali, in terms of the anti-race, anti-Asian, all the things that are related to that, for our community, we're pretty passive. When it comes to major issues that are out of our control and are outside the community, again, it goes back to bringing the information to the community and just keeping them up to date with the current issues that are happening. I think it's as someone that is active in CAN, that's where you'll see a lot of the COFA communities that are, or the people from the COFA Island nations. This is where you see people that have more of an understanding of what's happening outside the COFA Alliance National Network. Thank you. So it really depends on who you're talking about or who you're talking to. If you go to our elders, they probably won't take a stand or don't know which side or what's happening. But if you talk to the advocates, the leaders, those are probably where you will get the most conversation from.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Jess. We are coming up on time, so I think we're going to wrap this conversation there. Also, a big thank you to May for sharing and recording her responses before today. And as I mentioned, this is May's email. She is open to follow-up questions. You can reach out to her directly. And we are going to take a 10-minute break at this time. Please go refresh your waters and coffees and take a bio break. We'll be back at 10:25. So if you can come back a minute or two before that even, that would be great. Thank you. Hey folks, we are coming back at 10:25, so folks can start to trickle back in, get some water. We're gonna take this next chunk of time to talk a little bit more big picture about Asian Pacific Islander communities in Oregon. And before we kind of jump into our presentation piece, I would love to invite Niyati Desai from the Oregon Community Foundation to share a few words with us as well. Thank you, Niati. Appreciate you sharing with us. This next chunk of time is going to focus on our communities in Oregon. It gives a very broad context for this conversation. I'm about to do all of the aggregation and all of the lack of specificity because it's going to be fairly broad, but I did want to provide some context on some of the numbers that we have, a little bit of history, and a little bit of analysis that has been done on the current kind of network of Asian Pacific Islander organizations. And we're going to share a lot more information that you can delve deeper into after this convening. So if you feel like this was not enough, it is not enough, please keep learning and reading and engaging. And I also wanted to name that my bias around this information and knowledge around our communities really skews towards Asian communities and particularly East Asian communities. And so I have tried to bring in my learnings and share information about various Asian Pacific Islander communities, but just wanted to name that I am also in a learning process of learning the diversity, the great diversity of our communities, and also look forward to our speakers in the final segment where they will go kind of more into depth with their specific communities. So in this next slide, I want to dive a little bit into the history context. This is going to be very cursory, but you know, there's many different experiences of communities migrating to Oregon. Some of our communities are newer to the state, recent immigrants. Some communities have literally been here for centuries. Starting with the Native Hawaiians are among the earliest Asian and Pacific Islander groups to immigrate to Oregon in the late 1700s and early 1800s. They were known as Kanakas and came to the Northwest to get involved with fur trading business at that early time. And they have had lasting impact on the state with their presence, seen in some cases through place names. Today, Native Hawaiians make up the largest category among the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander, the census category. 38% of that NHPI demographic is Native Hawaiian today. Another community that's been in Oregon for centuries is the Chinese community. Early gold strikes in the Rogue Valley and in Eastern Oregon drew many Chinese immigrants north from California. And the Chinese population grew substantially between 1860 and 1880. And then, you know, a long history of working on railroads and canneries and various areas and owning businesses. Today, the Chinese population is the largest among Asian groups. The Chinese, except Taiwanese, category in the census data is 21.6% of all Asians in Oregon. Another community that has been here for quite a while is the Japanese population, which grew in the late 1800s and early 1900s, most coming again to work in railroads, canneries, and farming. In the early 1900s, most Japanese immigrants in Oregon lived in Portland's Nihonmachi, or Japantown, which is present-day Old Town Chinatown. Many also lived and farmed in the Hood River Valley, and family farms bearing Japanese American names exist to this day across Oregon. The Sikh community has also been in Oregon for a long time, like Chinese laborers. Sikh laborers also came to work in Oregon to build railroads, as well as work in canneries and timber mills. Filipinos were also migrating to the West Coast and to Oregon in the 1900s, and in the 1930s began to play an important role in farming Willamette Valley hops. Today, Filipinos make up the second largest Asian group in Oregon at 16% of the Asian population. So that's kind of the early, a couple examples of early trends of migrations. In the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about exclusion, you know, starting with the earliest arrival of Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and Asian folks in Oregon. Our communities were met with racism and xenophobia in terms of policies, laws, incidents, language, and violence. And given our short time, I just wanted to highlight 3 of them that I think point to some broader themes around the backlash that folks experienced in the state. Also, if you have questions, we'll do a brief Q&A after this. You can drop those in the chat as we're going along as well. But just to start with the Oregon State Constitution of 1857, which I'm sure most folks know is a very problematic document in many different ways, also encoded many racist notions, including language stating that no Negro, mulatto, or Chinese could vote. And the Constitution denied the rights of citizenship to Chinese people as well as African Americans, and set the tone for a whole range of laws passed in the state that create burdens or barriers for Asian and Pacific Islanders who are just trying to live their lives here. This included an 1866 law banning interracial marriage, and that law specifically prohibited intermarriage between whites and Chinese and Hawaiians. Other laws barred people from owning or leasing land or property. It taxed Asian workers and business owners specifically. Businesses that were owned by Asian Pacific Islanders were targeted. There was also discrimination in housing, just kind of a whole host of encoded policies, not to mention all of the kind of racism that one can experience outside of law in interpersonal and violent ways. The next example I wanted to lift up is the infamous law of 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act. Not the first anti-immigrant law, and certainly not the last, but a really monumental one that was the first to bar immigration for a specific nationality. It barred Chinese immigration to the US. It was renewed for several times until it was repealed in 1943. So a long stretch there where that exclusion was in place. And that was an example of state laws and national laws that banned immigration from China at first, but then also strictly limited immigration from all of Asia and basically from all non-white, non-European immigration, which wasn't lifted until the 1960s. And kind of a corollary to that, right, for the folks who were already here, a lot of laws that denied citizenship and access to citizenship and the rights that afforded to non-white immigrants. And there were many individuals who challenged those laws in court as well. Very interesting interplay of like, who is white, who is not white, what counts, what doesn't count, kind of in our racial hierarchy of white supremacy in the US, basically. And then, this culminates in one of the most egregious examples of the denial of rights during World War II with the passage of Executive Order 9066 that incarcerated Japanese Americans. Most Japanese Americans in Oregon were sent to Minidoka in Idaho, as well as to Tule Lake in California and Heart Mountain in Wyoming. And I think this just handful of examples shows that there's this history and legacy of racism and xenophobia that we hear reverberating to today with the increased visibility around anti-Asian hate and during COVID. And it may seem kind of like a new phenomenon when you're seeing it in the headlines, but we know that the sentiment is actually centuries deep in this country. And I also want to highlight that throughout history, as today, there are many leaders and advocates who have called out and challenged this racism, whether it was folks who continue to just build their businesses and their livelihoods here in the face of this backlash, to those who took on leadership in their communities, ran for office, challenged issues in the courts. I have not had time to include all of those here, but just definitely want to highlight that that is the case, and also that this history, right, links to the broader threat of white supremacy in the state, and that I think in our work and in having this convening, it is certainly not at all to advocate that Asian and Pacific Islanders be supported or funded at the cost of other communities, right? This is a coalition of solidarity that we want to build. And part of building our capacity is also so that we can be advocates for a broader racial justice movement as well. In the next slide, I just want to bring us up to some more recent trends with immigration. I mentioned the that immigration quotas were lifted in the 1960s with the Immigration Act of 1965. Again, a policy that was really paved for by the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. And this opened up a lot of immigration from Asia, as well as other parts of the world, non-European immigration. It provided for more reunification and family immigration, but it also gave priority to professionally skilled and educated workers over laborers. And so that was definitely a different trend in the more recent immigration. Some of the fastest growing groups since the 70s include South Koreans, South Vietnamese, Cambodians, Laotians, Thai, Indonesians, and certainly an influx of refugee populations after the conflicts in Southeast Asia and wars there. And then we also talked earlier with Jess and Kathleen about the Compact of Free Association. So this is an agreement that was formally established in 1986 between the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and the Republic of Palau in the United States. And it gives the US the right to set up military bases and deny other nations access to Micronesia in exchange for defense. And it also allows citizens of Copa Island nations to live and work in the US. And so there are many Pacific Islander communities who have arrived more recently and are smaller but rapidly growing communities. And actually, Oregon has the largest concentration of Copa Islanders on the US mainland. And while Copa Islanders are able to live and work in the US, we mentioned that they were not able to access many benefits, including things like Medicaid. And as Kathleen mentioned, it was not until the COVID-19 pandemic, the major impact on Pacific Islander communities that Medicaid was expanded to cover Copa Islanders at the end of 2020. We can go to the next slide. We're going to turn to some data. So we worked with partners at Willamette Partnership and Insight for Action to compile some of the latest 2020 census data to better understand what this data shows about our communities. There is this tool that they have developed online that you can check out by going to this bit.ly link. And there's a screenshot here that I have of that tool, and the top banner there has a picture of some folks. You can't tell, but they're sitting on the floor and they're looking at each other, and two of them are wearing masks. And I just wanted to quick note on data. We've already kind of touched on data in different ways because we know that it can be very powerful, but it can also be very fraught. And so we know that, as the census does not ask people for all the ways that they identify or give options for all the groups that identify, we know there are issues with how to get folks actually counted, as many of us were involved in the 2020 census count. And that data has also been used to ignore communities or justify not focusing on or not funding communities. And I think I've heard from Pacific Islander colleagues, that they have heard folks say your population is too small or it is statistically insignificant, which is just awful, I think. And so wanted to highlight that the data can be fraught and it can be very powerful, especially when disaggregated, which has been a big theme, but also that it can be complicated. And the data we're about to go through are broad strokes, and we are still very much, there is more information in this data tool, and we are working on more disaggregation and more data tools with our partners. So the next slide, we have the population growth of the communities. NHPI, again, stands for Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander. That is the category that the census uses. NHPI and Asian populations are among the fastest growing racial groups in Oregon and in the country. The population of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders grew 54% in the last decade and 48% among Asians in the past decade, which is actually faster than those rates nationally. And so we're seeing that increase here in Oregon. We have a photo of someone standing behind a table that has some plants and some paperwork on it. And then in the next slide, we have another photo of some folks pushing a kind of cart full of bags. And this is around some COVID response, I believe. The statewide population of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders in 2020 was almost 40,000 people, making up almost 1% of the total state population. The Asian population was 275,000 people, just about, and that made up 6.5% of the state's total population. And so I think this underscores again that Asian and Pacific Islander communities are part of the fabric of a diversifying Oregon and diversifying country. And so I think as part of that diversifying of the nations, we see our communities as part of those multiracial coalitions. So in the next slide, wanted to talk about where folks are based. I'm not sure if folks can see that. It is available in that data tool. This is a map of Oregon with counties highlighted with higher concentrations of Pacific Islander communities. When we look at folks across the state, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander populations are more distributed throughout, especially in Marion County around Salem and counties in Eastern Oregon along the Columbia River. Marion County, Washington, and Multnomah counties have larger populations as well as larger percentages of Pacific Islanders. But there are also high percentage of Pacific Islanders in smaller counties, including Union and Wasco and Polk counties. And then in terms of cities, LeGrand has the highest share of population who is Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander at 4%. Next slide, please. So this again is another map of the Oregon counties when shaded by which counties have higher populations. The Asian population in Oregon is more concentrated around the I-5 corridor. Some of the counties with the highest percentage of Asian residents are Washington, Multnomah, Benton, and Clackamas. And then cities with the highest share of Asian population include Happy Valley, River Grove in Clackamas County, Hillsborough, and Beaverton. Next slide, please. So one of the ways that we've had our community described as a community of contrast. We've talked a lot about the diversity of ethnicities and cultures and languages that are very different and diverse, while at the same time profoundly linked by the impact of racism and systemic inequities. And so the ethnicities here that are in red are Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander ethnicities that are most common in Oregon, and the Black are Asian. There are also many communities not named here. So there are 30% of the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander population in Oregon actually identifies as an ethnicity that's not listed here. I think we've mentioned, Kathleen shared a lot of different islands and nations in her piece as well. Among the Asian population, as I kind of mentioned earlier, Chinese, Filipino, and Vietnamese are the largest group, making up just over half of the Asian population. And there are still, again, many more groups that are not listed here, as well as minority communities that may not be captured at all through census data. We know that we are not a singular community, and that combining all of our data glosses over the real needs that specific communities and counties face. And so when we have disaggregated data, when we have data that is specific to Asian communities, specific to Pacific Islander communities, and then within those ethnic categories, we can better understand how a community is being impacted by systemic issues. So we've referred to this data from COVID before. Again, that this disaggregation of Pacific Islander out from an overall API category has really highlighted the rate and impact of COVID. And then you also heard from Jess and Kathleen that still didn't help, guide folks in specific communities, and they wanted the more disaggregated data to understand those impacts more closely, right? So this plays out in health data, in education data, in civic engagement in many areas. And in the next slide, I want to also look at specific ethnicities. And this is a table that I pulled from a 2014 report by the Coalition for Communities of Color and PSU, Portland State University, that draws data from 6 school boards in Multnomah County and shows the mean score for the students by ethnicity. That I believe this is like 2011 data. So a bit dated, but was one of the clearest examples I could find of how disaggregating the data shows a different picture. So in the next slide, we'll zoom in on the bottom part of this graph where we see that there are some particularly Asian ethnicities that are scoring very high. And then when we zoom in the next slide to the upper part of the graph, we see that there are ethnicities that are scoring much lower, where there are specific supports that are needed. And so, you know, if all of this data was aggregated, we may not have seen this disparity. It may have actually looked like Asian and Pacific Islanders are doing better than average. But disaggregating this helps us understand where there are interventions needed, and then where we can plug in with community leaders to provide support that is relevant and meaningful, and with folks that people can trust. In the next slide, I want to kind of turn us to thinking about those community organizations, right? Whether it is in terms of interventions and supports around healthcare or education or housing or business ownership or jobs, all the way to who is represented in leadership positions at those places, at those institutions, in our elected offices. You know, we wanted to look at the network of organizations. And I think, you know, Apano in a lot of ways has been kind of this larger umbrella organization. But as I mentioned in the very first panel, right, that coalition is only as strong as those individual community leaders and organizations to be able to connect and serve their communities as they would like to, and have the capacity to come together and uplift communities and build power together. And so I want to share some information about an analysis that we partnered with Kate Fagerholm from Yes Ampersand Consulting and in partnership with the Oregon Worker Relief Fund, where she interviewed community groups and leaders on their capacity to serve their communities and access supports like the Oregon Worker Relief Fund, which was for undocumented Oregonians, and actually Asians and Pacific Islanders make up 14% of those living in Oregon without documentation. And she interviewed 28 individuals representing 24 unique organizations and API identities, and compiled them in a report, and we'll share that brief afterwards. But to highlight some of those key takeaways was one was trust, right? We heard this from Jess and Kathleen earlier as well, that, you know, when community members can trust the folks who are helping them navigate different issues, different services, that the outcomes greatly improve. You know, this is also related to like language access and translation. And what we find and what we've heard is that people end up taking on multiple roles in their community, and that by doing that, this relates to capacity, people get maxed out, right? They have their full-time jobs, and then with their quote unquote spare time, they are helping community members, leading organizations, volunteering on boards. And so this can manifest as burnout or overcommitment or turnover or diminished engagement. And so what Kate highlighted out of her report really was that these kinds of things, community space, a dedicated paid staff, unrestricted funding for current work, offset costs for community and board volunteers, and culturally specific professional services could really be transformative for the capacity that exists within like the community specific grassroots organizations that have that most direct impact to community members. And so that's where a lot of our conversations now are. I'm hoping we can dig deeper to understand some of the specific contexts that communities have in our next section. But again, this is kind of where this impetus came for this convening as well, that we wanted to share the importance of understanding our different communities, but also the ways that in partnership with folks like you all, we can really build that capacity, build a strong ecosystem of organizations that can reach out to and meet all of our diverse communities here. So I will pause there. And so unless there are some questions, I can take questions in the chat. Otherwise, we can take 10-minute break, and then we'll come back to dive a little more deeply into some specific communities with our community leaders. All right, folks, I think we're gonna come back together here for our final conversation. So I would like to turn things over to Kale, who is Apano's Immigrant and Program Manager. Kale, over to you.
Hello there, everyone. So once again, my name is Kale Turn, and I'm the Immigrant Program Manager at Apano. So once more, I want to take the moment to thank everyone for attending and learning with us here today here at Apano. Here at Apano, we envision a just world where Asians and Pacific Islanders and communities would share our aspirations and struggles, have the power, resources, and voice to determine our own futures, and where we work in solidarity to drive political, social, economic, and cultural change. So you've heard us talk about disaggregation of data, and we encourage you to continue to ask questions and learn more about the Asian Pacific American communities in Oregon and across the United States. As we engage in continuous learning, we urge you to seek creative and innovative ways to support our communities. I wanted to give some attention to the anti-Asian hate that's been happening these past few years, and that they have presented us with these insurmountable challenges. Now, the anti-Asian hate and racism has exposed our Asian American and Pacific Islander communities to physical violence and discrimination all across the United States and around the globe. I also want to emphasize at this point that that's not why we're here today. We are here today to see how we can support the work that is being done for social justice, equity, and inclusion amongst our API communities. We are here to learn about how we can support and contribute to the wonderful and difficult work the API communities are doing. Because even in the backdrop of all the hate and violence, there's wonderful work that is being done. And there's also work that still needs to be supported to advance equity and inclusion to API communities in Oregon and also across the United States. So this session is called In Your Own Words. During this session, we will be sharing some stories to help each of you better understand the nuances and unique experience of members from specific communities, and to recognize the importance of leadership from those communities that have that provides direct support to their own communities. It's important because the Asian American Pacific Islander communities are a diverse community in itself. Just to give you some examples, our Cambodian communities, and up until recently, the Lao, weren't able to have families visit the US because of the visa bans the federal government has placed. Millions of Asians are separated from families because of long backlogs for green card processing. Where some are struggling just to get recognized, and some are struggling just to get the help and support that they so deserve. The point is, as many of you may already know, our API communities are diverse, and the impact of issues is just as diverse. And we've talked today about the importance of understanding the unique experiences of specific communities and how those in the community are the experts in their own experiences, with their own experience. These leaders here today are those experts, and they work alongside their communities every day, and they're going to share a little bit about it. So we'll have our speakers each share some prepared remarks, and then we'll have a group discussion afterwards. So I want to remind everyone that these folks represent just a few examples of the many community leaders in Oregon who are doing deep community work. We encourage folks to keep making connections with many different community organizations. If you have any questions for the speakers, please share them in the chat as we go along. But before I introduce you to our panel, I want to respect and acknowledge that unless they indicate for themselves that no one is speaking on behalf of all of their communities, all Asians, all Pacific Islanders, leaders in Oregon who are doing deep community work with their respective communities, the goal of this time is to help folks be more thoughtful and curious about the nuances of specific communities rather than painting APIs with the broad brush. So I wanted to introduce to everybody to May Se Chow, who was previously introduced. She is a Yumian community advocate. She has led summer activities for youth and youth leadership workshops in her community. And she is also a consultant for the Yumian Leadership Board here in Oregon. We will be sharing a recording of her message here. I also wanted to share some hobbies that she likes and how she keeps herself grounded. She enjoys everything culinary, cooking, trying new foods, learning new recipes. She loves learning about new cultures and traveling. She enjoys spending time learning and sharing space with animals, running yoga, and enjoys time with her kids, family, and family-related activities.
I've chosen 3 slides that I thought would really be able to share with everyone about who the Mian community is, who we are. So my first slide is talking about who is my community. A large part of my community has to do with the history and how we got here. Tell you a little bit more about it. During the later part of the Vietnam War, there was a mission called the Secret War. Its name is very telling. It was the secret war put together by the CIA. At the time, the Yumian and a lot of other indigenous hill tribes around the area of Laos were recruited to help them in their mission of fighting against the Vietnamese soldiers. You know, in the process of fighting, there was a big fallout. A lot of, bad things happened to our community. The ones that were abandoned, left behind, were persecuted. There were hundreds and thousands of people herded into huge refugee camps who stayed there for several years in really dire conditions, before they were able to even immigrate to the United States or Europe. Fast forward, 45 years later, we're here, but it's been really hard. It's been really difficult. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of families who are still struggling. And there is a lot of trauma that has not been dealt with, with the most recent events in Afghanistan. A lot of our community members found themselves reliving the past when the Afghanistan situation happened most recently, because they had also been guides. They had also been translators, interpreters. They had also been families who had been promised, income or resources for assisting the military. And a lot of what happened during the fallout is exactly what happened to our community as well. It's important that you learn the history of not just my community, but really all the other communities in under the API umbrella, because not everybody shares the same pathways and how they got here to the United States. Southeast Asians were very much, they had hard journeys here. We did not come over under the same immigration system or pathway as a lot of the other Asian communities. So it's really important that you are able to distinguish that. For my slide 2, I'm going to talk a little bit about engagement with my community and what you should know when doing so. I would say one of the most important things for us is to be able to have space. Having space to build relationships, but having a space to really share with others about our rich culture. As Indigenous people, we don't really get that opportunity much. Even in the broader API communities, we don't really engage or interact much with others. And so there's not really much opportunity to do so. I would say one thing that would make a big difference in my community is investment in our community. It is not just providing financial resources. What I would like to see is an organization or people really having a vested interest in us and really understanding who we are, really understanding our culture, our history, our people. When I'm talking about investment, I'm really more concerned about time. I find that it's really easy to provide financial resources, but it's also really important to really know who your recipients are as well. I feel like it's also really important to invest because it uplifts communities, it empowers them, and it provides them a sense of belonging, especially for people who are not commonly in spaces where they have the opportunity to engage with others.
Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Jesse Gaspar, who we previously introduced. Jess is the president of the Oregon Marshallese Community Association. He says that why he does the work, he wants to see a better future for the Marshallese people, and he enjoys playing basketball.
I'm going to talk a little bit about my organization and who I work for. So the Oregon Marshallese Community Association, established in April 2019, is a not-for-profit 501c3 registered public charity and community advocacy organization for the citizens of the Republic of the Marshall Islands and their descendants residing here in Oregon. Our primary mission is to maintain the culture and tradition and help improve the quality of life for Marshallese citizens here in Oregon. Next, please. And the Republic of the Marshall Islands is a sovereign nation in Oceania. The Marshall Islands are a sprawling chain of coral atolls in the central Pacific Ocean between Hawaii and the Philippines. Next slide. A little bit of history and nuclear legacy. From 1946 to 1958, it serves as a Pacific proving grounds for the United States, as was the site of the 67 nuclear tests on various atolls. The first hydrogen bomb, codenamed Mike, was tested at Enewetak Atoll in the Marshall Islands on November 1st, 1952 by the United States. Nuclear testing began in 1946 on Bikini after residents were evacuated. Over the years, 67 nuclear tests were conducted, including a 15 megaton Castle Bravo hydrogen bomb test, which produced significant fallout in the region. The Castle Bravo is about 1,000 times stronger than the bomb was dropped at Hiroshima. So I give you kind of like a perspective of how strong that bomb was. The testing concluded in 1958. Over the years, just one of over 60 islands was cleaned by the U.S. government. Just one out of the 60, which is it's to me is still crazy. And the inhabitants are still waiting for the $2 billion in compensation is assessed by the Nuclear Claims Tribunal. Many of their islanders and their descendants still live in exile, as the islands remain contaminated with high levels of radiation. I think there was a study, and it shows that the high levels of radiation, it's stronger and it's more than the one in Chernobyl. So just to give you kind of like a context, but I am one of those descendants as well. My grandfather was the first reverend in the Bikini Atoll. He was exiled from Bikini and asked to leave his island because the United States wanted to flex their nuclear arsenal to the world and show how strong they are. And it's still something that our elders still talk about till this day. We're not able to go back home. We miss our home, and we're not able to do things that we were so used to. And in the Marshallese culture, having a home or having land, something that you can call your own, that comes back to that identity. It's very important to us. And having no home is basically, it takes away from your identity. It takes away from what you're mostly proud of. And this is something that's really big in our culture, and we're still trying to fight um, the U.S. government on and what we believe that we deserve uh, for what had happened, this atrocity that happened to our people. And we didn't know what we were getting into. We were a couple of islanders that really didn't know anything. And we were asked to leave, and we thought it was going to be good for a couple of months and we can come back. But we made a decision, and based on what they told us, and to this day, it still hasn't been honored. We still haven't been able to go home. So nowadays, because of our relationship with the United States, 1/3 of the Marshall Islands has moved to the United States through a special relationship between the U.S. and the Marshall Islanders in an agreement called the Compact of Free Association, or COFA. This international agreement allows the Marshallese to live and work and move freely between the two countries without a normal visa requirement. Currently around 30 to 40,000 Marshallese now reside in the U.S. Many come to flee from the effects of climate change while also seeking better opportunities in education, work, and healthcare. We talked a little bit about the nuclear legacy and how that affects healthcare. A lot of our folks have thyroid cancer. A lot of our folks, they die at that 50 to 60-year range, and we still haven't connected the dots on how this is affected. But we do know that when the United States kind of took over, and they were sending food to the Bikinians, especially, all of it was canned meat. A lot of it was processed meat. That's what we lived on for a long time. Well, life in the U.S., most Marshallese, when they come to the U.S., they expect this Hollywood type of life. What they see in the movies, what they see in the limelight, and in the little things that they see back home. What they see is a different set of challenges when they do come there. And they must overcome here in the States, like language, lack of certified translators in hospitals, schools, and courts. It's a big barrier to our community. Insufficient incomes, reliance on easily exploited and low income work. Jobs like working at Tyson's chicken poultry, plant, that it's easy for them to get into. A different way of life, cultural misunderstanding from receiving community members, and then racism, overly racist treatment by service providers and even the public. When they see the way that we dress or when they see the way that we act in public, that's a little different. We feel that racism treatment towards our people. Hopes and dreams. We feel that in order to help Marshallese, we need to be equipped. The Marshallese need to be equipped with the tools and the resources, necessary for us to thrive. We know our people, and we want to be able to help our own people. We're not looking, for charity. We're not looking for. We are working every day to make life better for our own people, and that's the reason why we came to the United States. But many Marshallese organizations, many Marshallese organizations, we just had a leadership summit. And many Marshallese organizations like ours continue to receive far or too little financial support to be effective in what they can do for their people, because they don't have the resources there. And if there are opportunities, we don't understand the grant writing process, even the language sometimes on these long application processes that hinder, what a Marshallese person can apply for, excuse me. But we just had a leadership summit where we invited presidents, chair people of these grassroots organizations all across the United States. And the biggest thing that we got from them is like, hey, we know how to organize our people. We know what we need. It's just harder for us to, like, number one is to fill out the 501c3 applications, or even when we're at that stage where we got our exempt, when we're looking for grants or when we're looking for resources, it's so hard to communicate with the funders and the donors because of what they put out there. We don't understand the language. So I'm here to express that to all of you, that sometimes a Marshallese person who loves gathering and organizing his or her people, it's really hard for them to understand these long applications. And we need your help to help ourselves. We need your help. I know a lot of the donors, a lot of the funders and organizations, they want to help us, but it's hard for us to do it without you really sitting down with us and explaining the whole process. Thank you so much.
Thank you, just for sharing, just hearing from what May shared and what you're sharing. I see some common issues here. There's, although we've given, we, as in the API communities across the US, an opportunity to thrive here in the US, we weren't necessarily provided the tools necessary, the skills to be able to access the available resources. And we are, just really learning at this point to be at the same level of some of the organizations, more well-established organizations that are accessing the help to serve their community. And I think it is really important for our audience and the funders to recognize these barriers and somehow work with us or create programs that or fund programs and support that help us reach out to our communities, work better with our communities to serve our communities. And that's a skill that I think organizations need to learn, and we need to help provide. So thank you. Our next speaker I want to introduce is Gloria Lee. Gloria is a board director of the Chinese American Citizens Alliance in Portland, and has had extensive experience in nonprofit work. She was the opening executive director of the Lansu Garden and is the retiring executive director of the Giving Tree Northwest. She's also served on many different boards. She enjoys gardens and flowers, particularly in the Lansu urban oasis of tranquility and culture. Great moment of Zen. She feels like it brings great moment of Zen and reflection. She also informs us that digging in the dirt is therapeutic. The digging stirs up microbes in the soil. Inhaling these microbes can stimulate serotonin production, which can make you feel relaxed and happier. So I didn't know that. It's great information. So Gloria.
Good afternoon, everybody. And I'm pleased to see so many funders, organizations, governmental agencies, friends, people I know, people I don't know, join in this convening as we elevate and disaggregate the many Asian communities. The Chinese American history begins with the railroad workers from Guangdong province in the Pearl River Delta. And this is about 1850. So when you start at that point, you have a very old history. As Ali referred to the Chinese Exclusion Act, which lasted 63 years from 1882 to 1943, and then renewed until finally taken off the books somewhere in 1960. But it was the only law that prevented all members of a specific ethnic or national group from immigrating to the United States. And there's a lot of, you can imagine, disruption of families and a lot of hardship during that time. So in 1895, the Chinese Americans in San Francisco established the Native Sons of the Golden State in response to the racism, the prejudice that limited opportunities for employment, education, housing, and that's where the word redlining comes in, insurance, and banking. Even today, the San Francisco Lodge maintains insurance policies that if you're a member of the Chinese American Citizens Alliance San Francisco Lodge, upon your death, you will receive an insurance stipend. That is our history of being a 501c3 as a fraternal organization. So why are we a 501c3? Because of these issues where we've been so discriminated against, where we couldn't even be in a dance hall together with other people. So we formed our own fraternal organizations to socialize and stay in community. In Portland last year, we celebrated our 100th anniversary, and you can see that it's the long history means change is necessary and is coming forth. Some of our lodges, and there are 20 of these fraternal lodges across the United States that fall under the umbrella of the Chinese American Citizens Alliance National. Some of us are 501c3s also. Portland is a 501c3. We're dedicated to enhancing civic pride, supporting our community with services as needed, and promoting responsible citizenship. We do this through our leadership conference that we've been running for over 20 years with high school students. We do this through civic engagement, voter registration, and education. And we do this through supporting our community, especially our elder community. We also do some programs that may be changing. We also translate for the server education for liquor licenses, because we found that Chinese were unable to secure their liquor license permit to work in restaurants without support and translation. So over the years, some programs have been sunsetted. For instance, as it became less discriminatory for Chinese students to play basketball, we discontinued after 43 years our wonderful basketball program because the need wasn't as high as it was then. So we're ever evolving. Most currently, our recent achievement, there's a slide up that doesn't need to be up right now, but nationally, our most recent achievement has been recognition of over 20,000 Chinese Americans who fought in World War II without their rights of citizenship. And they've only been recently recognized through our advocacy in Congress through the Congressional Gold Medal, which we're proud to say took us the shortest time possible, which was 2 years of walking the halls of Congress in Washington, D.C. to get that medal through. Unfortunately, most of our veterans have passed away, and those gold medals are now going to the heirs and the families of those World War II veterans. Many of them gave their life for this country when they were not even citizens. Okay, back to slide 2 there. Our core programs comprise of new and old programs. In that first slide, you see a bunch of high school students sitting in bleachers, and that is our Asian American Youth Leadership Conference. It is now 2 decades old, and we bring students from Oregon and Southwest Washington. There is a prevailing notion that there are no disadvantaged Asian students. The truth of the matter is that there are many Asian students coming from refugee and first-generation immigrant families. These students struggle to overcome language, to be part of the community. They face cultural and prejudice in dealing with other community members, and parents are pushing them to excel in school. So we once a year do the Asian American Youth Leadership Conference, which is a one-day event, but has expanded to also include some scholarships and some ambassador programs. This year, the theme is going to be called Connecting Our Truth, and it will be held in person on April 22nd. But for the safety of students and parents, we're also going to hold a virtual Zoom conference on May 14th so that we can be inclusive of all the needs in our community. prior to the pandemic, which is the second picture you see with the ballot box, we registered over 400 Chinese Americans who became citizens and never exercised their right to vote because the process was foreign, the language was difficult, and they were afraid. And this year, we will be returning, as is appropriate, because we have a lot of issues coming up on the ballot that will return to in-person civic engagement. And we need help in reaching out across the state of Oregon. We're not adequately funded to be able to do that. We are also, it takes a lot of training to be able to translate and work with the ballot measures across many different communities. The dialect can be Mandarin, it can be Cantonese, it can be Shanghainese, and frankly, most of us have trouble understanding the English words in the ballot when English is our first language. So you can imagine that it takes a lot of work, pre-work, in order to hold these voter engagement, what I call parties, because we always have good food. Okay, so lastly, that third slide you see is the pandemic and the stay-at-home orders isolated many Asian seniors. And we got a call from the Asian Health and Service Center that they needed some assistance because they had to shut down their congregate meal food program. So through collaboration and partnership, we're now working to make the Asian pantry a permanent fixture. Thanks to funding from many people that are here in this meeting, we were able to serve we serve about 185 households currently in downtown Portland that are Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, Hmong, and Min communities that are in the service area of downtown Portland. We are taking that model and moving it through to the Community for Positive Aging, which is the new name for the Hollywood Senior Center. And so we'll be adding on also serving Vietnamese families in Northeast Portland. It is a huge venture. It costs us about $5,000 a month. We've been fortunate to have funding through the Oregon Health Authority because of the pandemic, but now we're looking for other sustainable ways that we can establish culturally specific pantries, because what we have learned is that it is also a great tool for removal of isolation in our senior communities. It's an exciting venture, and if you are interested in that, I am leading it. I want to hear from you because we'll be putting together a paper about how to start culturally specific pantries. The next slide. Our challenges, what do we face as an organization that's well over 100 years old? Well, we're aging. We need to understand new technology and new recruitment strategies. Whether we are more of a 501c3 as a fraternal organization, or are we more focused towards moving to a 501c3, which we are, but what about a 501c4? Because we see the need to advocate for all Asian Americans, Chinese, and all the groups. I don't want to stop and say that as I was listening to Jess, I am really stunned, not surprised, that the challenges the Marshallese community face, that the Chinese Americans and the Chinese that have been here for over 100 years still face the same issues as they do. It is very sobering. We face the fact that we're still considered foreigners. We face the fact of being labeled a model minority. And oftentimes we still face a lot of anti-racism and racist attacks. But because of that, several years ago, we started advocating for ethnic studies in Oregon, and that passed in 2017. Of course, passing a law doesn't mean it's funded. So it passed in the Oregon legislature, and it was HB 2845, which means that we will establish ethnic studies for K through 12 education in the social science curriculum across the Oregon schools. The target now is that this implementation will happen by 2026. And there are, I think there's some people here from the Oregon Education Department, but I would like to say that it is really difficult when your history has been hidden, taken away, ignored, and diminished. And just buried. Some of you have heard me speak about some of that history at other places, but when that history is not recorded, it's very hard to produce the curriculum. And I'm happy to say that if there is any way that our organization can help with that, we'd like to the OED people here. So I think for Chinese and Chinese Americans, our culture is one of tolerance, collaboration, community, and resilience. And with your help and support, it is time to increase our visibility in fully participating and honoring our responsibilities as citizens. My email is glorialeeglow@yahoo.com. I can put that in the chat. I'm happy to take questions. I'm happy to value opinions. And thank you so much for this opportunity. Personally, I want to thank Apano also because I am Chinese American. English is the only language I speak. But until I started working with Apano, I did not know all the other Asian communities that reside in the state of Oregon. So I've learned a lot about culture, about food, about the challenges that are facing smaller ethnic communities. And I encourage everyone to learn more. Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria. And, I can't agree with you more. We pass ethnic studies, but we still need to fund it. And I think that was a good. So we have some time for some questions. So I want to ask, what's one thing, financial or non-financial, that will make a difference in your community? And this goes to anyone on the panel.
I'm sorry, Kale, can you repeat that?
Oh, I'm sorry. So what's the one thing, financial or non-financial, that would make a difference in your community?
For the Chinese and Chinese Americans, we have a lot of work to do for allyship, but I think the two things that are most important now is a plan for leadership transitions, because we are such an old organization. And that includes funding, because we have been an all-volunteer organization that has accomplished a tremendous amount of critical work, and it has become more and more challenging as nonprofits have gotten more and more complex.
We need help in everything. Funding, we need help. We need training on, just organizing the way that, American system works. We need help talking with our lenders, our funders. We need everything. So keep in mind that just 20 years ago, our compact, or just a little bit over 20 years ago, I'm not really quite sure. I'm sorry if I'm not a historian, but we started our working relationship with the United States. So there's a lot of things that we're still learning. How to be a nonprofit, how to write grants and things like that. We just need help on everything.
How can our attendees today support your organization and the work that you do or plan on doing?
I would say, reach out to us and get a better understanding of our people, our organizations. Look at it through an equitable type lens when speaking or trying to understand, Marshallese organizations or Pacific Islander leaders, what they're trying to accomplish, and try not to categorize us, because we have different cultures, we have different activities that we do with our communities. So one thing that might work for other communities is not going to work for us all the time, so I would just say, try to be open to different communities.
I think the openness gives opportunity to learn more, the willingness to learn. And I think engaging helps facilitate that learning. So I encourage our attendees to reach out, um, think of questions to ask, because learning happens when we ask questions. So let's kind of move away from the needs. And I'd like to kind of hear from each of you real quick. Like, what's a moment or an experience that made you feel really good, grateful, and happy about your community, or to being a part of your community?
For me personally, I was so proud of all the people that turned out for ballot translation in the 2016, is it, election. We had over 258 or 285, I can't remember, people that brought their ballots. We had trained 33 translators at the Asian Health and Service Center. And what I discovered is that they really want to learn. They really want to understand. They want to learn about democracy. They want to learn about the election process. I caught up in the moment of people that were, in their 80s, that have been in this country and a US citizen for 35 years that had never cast a ballot. Because of fear, because of language, because they didn't want to seem stupid, frankly. And this was an opportunity that was never offered to them, and they didn't know where to go. So I think that will always stay with me. I can get emotional talking about it because I didn't expect that, I guess.
Thank you for sharing, Gloria. Did you want to add to that, Jess?
I think community is an understatement when it comes to our people and our culture. I think we saw that in COVID-19 because our community likes to get together a lot. We try to unify and be in the same space as much as possible because that is our culture. And COVID-19 really kind of like, you need to isolate, you need to be by yourself. And I'm so proud that our community members, our community leaders were able to change that, from gathering so much and working together to where we're trying to safeguard our communities together. I saw that. It was a very proud moment for me because a lot of our folks didn't want to do that. They didn't want to comply. They just believed in spiritually faithful. They were like, God will take care of us. Let's continue the way we live. And here are these organizations that are like, hey guys, we also need to understand science and believe in the science. And we were able to speak that together to our community. So.
Thank you, Jeff. So one more question. In 1 minute, could you speak to the importance of having API staff in funder institutions and decision-making roles, or making those important connections to the community?
Yeah, I think it would be nice to have API or just somebody that understands or really wants to understand other cultures, and tries to view this from a cultural lens, equitable lens. So I think if the organizations, funders are making an effort, I think that's a starting point.
I think it will, I speak from an executive director level. I think it will save 50% of the time in learning and in onboarding a staff if the person comes with the particular professional skills that that position requires, and it's also of a ethnic community. And I'm not going to label it Asian or any, but I think being, frankly, I'm old enough to say being a minority is what I've been called, is because there's an overarching feelings and understandings of what that means. I think that helps, and what it means to have to bridge the white culture, the bureaucracy, and the standards that are different in different communities. And I could go into more detail, but that's a minute. But I do think that that is very valuable. I'm proud to say that over the years, because the Chinese American Citizens Alliance does award scholarships, we're finally beginning to see students applying for scholarships that are going into journalism, going into nonprofit work, going into public administration, and not necessarily being a doctor or a lawyer or an accountant, which was all we got even 5 years ago. So it's coming along.
Thank you, Gloria and Jess, and thank everybody for being present today. My name is Gail Turn, and I will pass it back to Allie.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kale, for facilitating, Gloria, Jess, also to May for sharing so much about your communities with us. I think we've gotten a chance to learn a little more deeply, particularly about like the Marshallese community, the Yunyan community, the Chinese American community as well. So those are 3 out of that like large number of ethnicities and communities that I had on the earlier slide, which didn't even capture a bunch of them. So I appreciate the kind of in-depth opportunity, somewhat in-depth, as much as you can do in 45 minutes to learn more, and also just to reiterate again that there's a lot of stories, a lot of communities, a lot of learning still to be had with the folks here and with the folks who are not here with us today. And so we're going to move into our closing, and I wanted to invite Carol from the Collins Foundation to share a few words.
All right, thank you so much, Allie. And hello, all my fellow supporters of Asians and Pacific Islanders here in Oregon. So I'm Carol Cheney. I'm a proud queer Korean American, born in the year of the water tiger, which is this year, and the CEO of the Collins Foundation, who's been given the honor to close out this amazing session. Just such an amazing, wonderful group of speakers and interesting information that I think provides us with some ideas on how we, as funders of these communities, could act. One of the things that somebody once told me was that I was also kind of like a cheerleader. I'm not 100% sure what I think about that, but I thought maybe I would use that today. Funders, often rally the team when it's flagging, and unfortunately, folks, for those of us who represent foundations and public agencies, I think our team is flagging a little bit. Our good friends at Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in Philanthropy, also known as APIP, produced an amazing report called Seeking to Soar: Foundation Funding for Asian American and Pacific Islander Communities. Keeping in mind that the report is focused on the philanthropic sector specifically. So for those of you in public entities, this may not be directly relevant, but I think probably you all might be experiencing something similar. So this this publication reported on national funding designated to Asians and Pacific Islander communities, and found that this funding only accounts for 0.2% of all U.S. grant making. I heard Jess say, do foundations give about 1%? Well, unfortunately, we're not even quite there. And I think the other sort of area where we're flagging is that this percent hasn't changed much at all since a similar report was published in 1992. So 3 decades ago, my friends, despite the fact that the API population in the US has more than doubled in size in that time. So I hope that as you were listening to our great speakers, that you honed in on some of the takeaways, any takeaways that move you forward, and not just move you emotionally, but move you beyond thinking more, studying more, or just talking more. I think it's time we act, and we have been armed with the data that we need. In fact, we've actually had it for quite a long time. So as I was listening, I heard about several opportunities that I would like to share with you that I kind of break down into inside strategies and outside strategies. So starting with some outside strategies, one that I heard was to get to know Asian and Pacific Islander organizations and communities and what they're doing for their communities. I think from cultural preservation to direct services to legislative policy change, I think we'll find a robust slate of fundable activities that simply just need support. That's kind of the easy one. Walking alongside organizational leaders as they try to access our confusing processes, I think is really, really important. Help them to understand what we can do and not do too as public entities and foundations. You know, the issues with the IRS are certain things that we have to do, but it's not actually a lot on our side, the foundation side. Ask questions that reduce or eliminate invisibilization of unique specific cultures and identities within the Asian and Pacific Islander communities we have here, in ways that both honor those identities, but also in ways that we can roll up as we need to into broader categories rather than calling communities insignificant. That's really hurtful and harmful. Support limited English proficiency populations through materials, through supporting funding for materials in multiple language and access to interpreters, really key. And provide funding or contracts or bilingual pay differentials for people who have those skills that allow us to better reach communities whose stories and experiences are shared much better in their own languages. Account for the intersectionality of identities among AAPI communities as well, gender identity, sexual orientation, mixed race. Those are just a few. And then in terms of inside strategies, let's assess our own grant and contracting data. Are our contracts, are our grants equitably supporting AAPI communities? I think it would be good if we could set some short-term goals to do that so we can report back out. Develop a list of cross-sector funding partners with shared goals and visions. You know, how can we work together to get more dollars out the door? And for my foundation partners, supporting our leaders in public or government entities with the kind of influence we can exert when public officials cannot. I used to work for state government. There were things that I could absolutely not talk about. And that's something we, and when we're more in the private sector, can step up to. Looking at the number of Asians and Pacific Islander leadership and philanthropy, that was the comment that came up at the very last, which I think is great. That actually have the responsibility and decision-making authority over the distribution of dollars. What are we doing to open that pipeline too? Can we provide mentorships and internships to bring more Asians and Pacific Islanders into our fold? So 2022 is the year of the tiger. So my big cheer is to let's emulate tigers who are courageous and energetic, who love a challenge or a competition and are prepared to take risks. And to close, hearkening back to one of my earlier remarks, with our wealth, power, and privilege as funders, as policymakers, as program designers who drive resources to support our AAPI communities. We can do it. Yes, we can. If we can't do it, no one can. I think that was a cheer I learned in high school. But especially, if we can't do it, how can the communities that we have heard from today live to their fullest potential in our state? So thank you very much for giving me the honor to speak to you and to share some ideas. And I look forward to hearing more and working with everyone more.
Thank you so much, Carol, bringing cheerleading and tiger energy to wrap our day. Appreciate that very much. I think I might need you to email me that list so I can share that back out as a follow-up with everyone, because that was a very specific list, and we would love to share it out. This is the end of our time pretty much. We have one final ask for folks that Emmy dropped in the chat, but we would love this to be kind of the start of connection and conversation. So if you could share your contact information, there's a form that got dropped. You can also go there via this bit.ly link. We would like to share your contact information with not only the partners who were here today, but also the rest of the Vote Network partners, other community organizations that we work with who are interested in getting in touch with funders. And so there's a question there for, what can I talk to you about? So please note that there. And I think that that will help facilitate folks to reach out and more connection. And we'll also send out a follow-up with a compilation of lots of resources and information from today. We'd also love to get feedback, so there'll be a survey there. I am kind of curious about what folks want to see as next steps, and hopefully as we are kind of coming to more of a reopening phase, perhaps we can actually be in person and continue to build on relationships further. So that's our next steps. Thank you all so much for spending your Friday morning with us. I know it's a long, long Zoom call. I appreciate you hanging in there, and hope everyone has just a wonderful weekend and that we'll all continue to be in conversation. Thank you.